Greeting everyone. We continue our discussion on endocrine system. In the second part, we will focus our discussion on the subtopic of chemical classes of hormone, hormonal cellular response pathway, and pituitary hormones. We start with chemical classes of hormone. Hormones can be divided into three major classes, which is polypeptide, amines, and steroid. And all these three classes vary in their solubility. Some soluble in water or aqueous, meanwhile others may higher solubility in lipid-rich environment. We begin with the first class, which is polypeptide. Most of the hormone under polypeptide, they either peptide or protein, and altogether we can refer them as a peptide hormone, which for example insulin. And all the hormone under polypeptide, they are water soluble or aqueous soluble. Meanwhile, amines, for example epinephrine, tyrosine, they derive from amino acid. And some of the hormone under amines, they are water soluble, and others they are higher solubility in lipid-rich environment. Meanwhile, steroid, for example cortisol and steroid, they refer to a group of hormones being produced by the adrenal cortex and gonads. Alright, gonads, for example, ovary and testes. And all hormones under steroid, they are non-water soluble, but their solubility very high in lipid-rich environment. Okay, chemical class of hormone: water soluble, polypeptide, lipid soluble, steroid. Example of polypeptide: insulin. Example of the steroid: cortisol. Amine depend on the type of hormone. For example, epinephrine, water soluble, but another type of the amine hormone, which is tyrosine, they are non-water soluble, or their solubility higher in lipid-rich. This demonstrates a structure, component or chemical structure of hormone. For example, insulin, oxytocin, T3 and T4. Cellular response pathway for hormone. So when hormone arrive at any target cell, it will initiate three key events. The first one we call as a reception. The second event we designated as a signal transduction, and normally it starts in the outside of the cell and travel to the inside of the cell. And the last event we designated as a response, or how the cell respond to having received the signal. So the response or the pathway differ in their path through a body. Either they are water or lipid soluble hormone. So for the water soluble hormone, for example, peptide hormone and some of the amine hormone, normally it will release to the blood circulation as a exocytosis. What is the exocytosis? Exocytosis refers to a vesicle containing hormone will fuse within the plasma membrane and allowing its content to be released outside the cell. In this case, in the adrenal tissues, the hormone being transported by vesicle. That vesicle will fuse with the plasma membrane and release the content to the interstitial fluid before diffuse into blood circulation. And in blood circulation, water-soluble hormone will travel freely in the bloodstream because they are water-soluble. Our blood consists of waters, and it can bind directly to cell surface receptor when they arrive at the target cell. In contrast to lipid-soluble hormone, after being produced in endocrine cell, it just simply diffuses out across cell membrane. And when the lipid-soluble hormone being transported in the blood circulation, they must bound to transport protein. They cannot simply travel freely in the bloodstream because they are not water soluble, so they need a special transporter. And when the lipid soluble hormone arrive at any target cell, they just simply diffuse through the membrane plasma of the target cell. So again, in the form of diagram, for the water soluble hormone, okay, let's say this is the endocrine tissues. When the endocrine tissue produce the hormone, the water soluble, will be transported using a vesicle. This vesicle later will fuse with the membrane plasma and release the water soluble hormone to interstitial fluid before the hormone will diffuse to blood vessel and freely transported via blood circulation. When they arrive at the target cell, the water-soluble hormone will diffuse out from the blood vessel and bind to the signal transporter. It will bind to the signal transporter. So the hormone itself will never physically fuse in. It just simply binds to the signal receptor where this interaction will trigger events that lead to either the changes in cytoplasmic response or the changes in gene regulation. If the changes occur to cytoplasmic response, it will induce the formation of new protein and induce the response. Meanwhile, it will trigger the gene regulation. Then gene regulation, the information will travel to cytoplasm before the response can be produced by target cell. In contrast to lipid-soluble hormone, when the endocrine cell produces the hormone, the lipid-soluble hormone just simply transport out by simple diffusion, enter interstitial fluid, diffuse to blood vessel, and they need a transport protein in order to be transported in blood circulation. When the lipid-soluble hormone arrive at the target cell, they just simply diffuse in and then travel to the signal receptor. And that interaction or the signal receptor complex will act as a transcription factor, normally by activating gene expression in order to induce or stimulate the cytoplasmic response. So again, for the pathway for the water-soluble hormone, the hormone will bind to the receptor and initiate a signal transduction, will lead to response in cytoplasm or enzyme activation, or maybe the changes in gene expression, and all these events actually to promote or stimulate the response. For example, epinephrine, right? For example, epinephrine. What is epinephrine? Or sometimes epinephrine also we known as adrenaline. So this adrenaline or epinephrine normally will released by medulla of our adrenal gland, and their main function is to increase cardiac output as well as to raise blood glucose level. Before our body responds to epinephrine, it will respond by increase the cardiac output or increase the level of blood glucose. What happens to epinephrine when they arrive at the target cell? It will bind to a receptor, or we also know that receptor as a G protein coupled receptor. It is located on the plasma membrane of the liver cell, and this reaction will trigger the release of messenger molecule that will activate the enzyme and result in the release of, in the form of diagram, epinephrine bind to the G protein coupled receptor, and it will stimulate a series of enzymatic reaction where at the end it will increase the blood glucose concentration, either by inhibit the glycogen synthesis or promote glycogen breakdown. Meanwhile, for the lipid-soluble hormone, normally it promotes the changes in gene expression. For example, steroid. thyroid hormone, and other hormonal form of the vitamin D will enter target cell and then bind to the protein receptor in the cytoplasm or nucleus. So this combination will form what we call as a protein receptor complex that will act as a transcription factors in the nucleus and regulate transcription of specific genes, right? Hormone from the extracellular fluid diffuse to the target cell and forming the hormone receptor complex. It will travel to the nucleus and triggers the release of the messengers, activate the enzyme in order to stimulate the response. For example, in female birds and frog, the estradiol, a form of estrogen, has a specific receptor in the liver cell, and this activates the transcription of the gene for the protein methylation. What the relationship in between hypothalamus, this is the hypothalamus, and pituitary gland? The hypothalamus is a region of our lower brain and it contains different set of neurosecretory cells. What is a neurosecretory cell? A neurosecretory cell refers to the hormone that capable to produce hormone, right? Again, neurosecretory is a neuron capable to produce the hormone. So the cell produce neurohormone. What is neurohormone? Hormone produced by neuron. And it can release either from the posterior pituitary, this is the posterior pituitary, or sometimes we use the term of neurohypophysis. And this neurohormone also released to the anterior pituitary, or we call them as adenohypophysis. This pituitary gland, we can divide by posterior and anterior. Posterior pituitary, we also know them as a neurohypophysis. Meanwhile, anterior pituitary, we know them as a adenohypophysis. Both capable to produce different type of hormone. Posterior pituitary produce two types of the hormone, right? Produce two types of the hormone that release from the posterior pituitary who made by neurosecretory cell in hypothalamus, and we call them as a neurohormone. Okay, the neuron in hypothalamus will produce neurohormone and release via posterior pituitary. For example, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, they are two types of hormone produced by posterior pituitary. What is the function of the oxytocin? Oxytocin responsible for induction of uterus contraction during childbirth and also for the milk ejection during nursing. Meanwhile, ADH or antidiuretic hormone responsible to increase water retention in the kidney and also to maintain blood osmolarity. What is blood osmolarity? It regulates the body's electrolyte water balance. That's the function of the ADH. When our bodies produce ADH, normally we also produce less urine because it will increase water retention. So again, posterior pituitary hormone produce two types of hormone, which is ADH, where target cell, kidney tubule, increase water retention and also regulate osmoregulation. Oxytocin, the target cell in mammary gland for the milk production and milk ejection, and also uterine muscle for the uterine contraction during childbirth. Anterior pituitary, they produce two groups of hormone we call as a tropic and non-tropic. So what is tropic hormone? Tropic hormone refers to a group of hormone that produced by one endocrine gland that their target cell is another endocrine gland. That is the tropic hormone produced by endocrine gland and their target cell also endocrine gland. Meanwhile, non-tropic hormone produced by endocrine cell, but their target cell is not non-endocrine. but it directly stimulates target cell to induce the effect. That's the difference between tropic and non-tropic. Tropic induce another cell to produce another hormone. Non-tropic stimulate the target cell to induce. This is a few examples of the hormone being produced by the anterior pituitary, for example, FSH, LH, TSH, ACTH. They are tropic hormone, and non-tropic, for example, prolactin, MSH, endorphin, and they are a hormone we call as a growth hormone. It can be non-tropic and tropic hormone. So it's a must for you to recognize which one is tropic hormone with the example, and which one is non-tropic hormone with example, and which one is can be both, either non-tropic or tropic effects, which is growth hormone. So we complete a second part of our discussion on endocrine system. We will continue in the third part. Thank you very much.